This week, I also wanted to bring up the topic of bioarchaeology, as I know many of you have an interest in bioarchaeology, are taking classes in biological anthropology, and I also thought it just kind of fit in nicely with our other topic this week, where we're starting to get into some modeling and interpretation based on the actual archaeological record. And then next week, when we look at inequality and inequity, we'll be able to kind of return back and revisit some of the concepts presented because of how things like status, for example, have been interpreted on the basis of grave goods and mortuary finds. So hopefully this topic doesn't seem out of place. I'm not going to go into this background at length. Again, this is just meant to be an overview of the topic, some basic background information, so that when we come into discussion, we are ready to go. So I don't expect you to answer these questions for me, but I want you to think about these questions. And if you don't know how to answer them, then we should talk about them in a lecture this week or in our Blackboard Collaborate session this week. And the reason for this is that this should hopefully be review from 206 when you took that when we did bioarchaeology, we talk about how we excavate human skeletal remains, the difference between burials and cemeteries. We talk about osteobiographies and the information that we can obtain from human skeletal remains. And how we use them in our interpretation. So now we're just going to revisit that. So whenever I have a review slide, it really is just meant for that, is to try to get your brain going back to something you've hopefully learned in one of your other anthropology classes leading up to this point. I also wanted then to revisit this, a really important topic, that one of the key things that we do when we produce an osteobiography for an individual is estimate the sex of that individual. Oh, sorry about that. So I have a bunch of notes about this down below. I posted the summary video here. Really, what I wanted to do here was not, again, reteach you the traits that are used, but get you thinking about, again, the process under which archaeologists make estimations about the sex of an individual using skeletal remains, right? And one of the key sources of information we do use, of course, is the skeleton, right? Of course, if we have access to it, funding for it, and if preservation environment was appropriate, that it's available, if it's part of an ethical protocol in terms of collection and sampling. Yes, we can also do genetic analyses of human skeletal remains. We can do other trace element and isotopic analyses as well. But our starting point is always looking at the skeletal traits themselves. And the reason why I also link this with our other topic, it relates to, again, this idea of sexual dimorphism and how we can actually identify it in bodies, right? And it becomes even more challenging when we're attempting to estimate or interpret or understand secondary sexual characteristics when we're dealing with skeletal remains, because of course soft tissue isn't preserved, right? And a lot of the traits that we do use for sex estimation or for assigning sex at birth, for example, are soft tissue things, right? So like external genitalia. In some cases, it might be an internal exam that includes looking at gonads. But yeah, right, when we have a skeleton, we don't have those options. I also want to point out that we use a system in bioarchaeology and biological anthropology wherein we recognize 5 skeletal sexes, right? Female, probable female, ambiguous, probable male, and male. And again, what this captures is the clinal variation in the traits that we use in sex estimation, right? But you'll note that when we talk about clinal variation, what that does then is it automatically sets up sex as a continuum from male to female or from female to male, right? And so this is something that we can talk about a little bit more in our discussion, is things like intersex variations, how that may or may not present itself in human skeletal materials, and therefore how that can then complicate our estimations of sex. One of the things that's come up in previous courses is talking about how things like hormone replacement therapy may be impacting the presentation of these traits in the skeleton as well. So looking forward into what bioarchaeologists will be doing hundreds of years from now, that potentially they can be making misinterpretations because of, again, what we can do now to modify our bodies, right? Including modify things like hormones so that the presentation of secondary sexual characteristics is different from what the chromosomes of the individual would suggest their sex is, right? So these are kind of the issues. So again, what I'm doing here is just showing you some of the traits that we use. You notice that the ones that we commonly teach, especially at an introductory level, so in a course like 206, or 209, are those that focus on the cranium and the pelvis. These have been demonstrated to be some of the more accurate bones. There are other methods and techniques that we can use to estimate sex using things like long bones, but the accuracy is not as high. Plus, one of the things that we often don't talk about in 206, although we do get into it a little bit in 209, is that the expression of these traits is also population specific. So while we can think of these as broadly representing what it means to be human and a sexually dimorphic species of primate, it's a little bit more complicated than that because of, again, the process of sexual selection and how we mate with people and population dynamics and all of those factors. So we have to account for what population we think that an individual could be from. And then we also have to think about how population and expression of traits have changed over time, right? And so this makes a lot of sense when we talk about things like stature, because we understand the role that nutrition plays and health plays in terms of the stature of individuals. But when we start to talk about sex, then all of a sudden people get a bit more rigid around their understandings, right? Again, this kind of adherence to a biological sex binary of male and female that doesn't necessarily capture our present reality, and therefore, because it doesn't represent what we know about sex today, we can't assume, therefore, that would also work or represent sex in the past and how it was understood in the past. So that's some of the traits I've captured here, right? Is that it's based on sexual dimorphism and development of secondary sexual characteristics. This means that it can be very difficult for sex estimation in subadults or in pre-puberty individuals because they haven't yet developed these secondary sex characteristics. We've already talked about last topic, 4.1, about how sexual dimorphism is low in humans, which means that, again, the expression of these traits, so between, if we look back at these charts, like a 5 here and a 1 here, while it looks pronounced between these 5 individuals, again, really how much more significant, right? Like how pronounced does it have to be a 5 versus a 4, etc. So there's a lot of skill and familiarity, what we might call, and training, or what might we call expertise that's required in order to readily, accurately distinguish these traits in individuals. Some of the accuracy of traits and also the analyses of particular bones can be fairly low as well. So we have to consider that. And then again, genetic analyses can also be limiting because just because you have a chromosomal pattern doesn't mean that's reflected, as we know from the various forms of intersex variation, in terms of like what your external genitalia are. And so people in the past wouldn't have been aware of their genome, so they wouldn't have been able to use that to assign sex to individuals, right? So we have to be cautious when we're using modern technologies to obtain pieces of data that people in the past themselves wouldn't have had access to, right? So again, I'm not saying that they're wrong or that these are problematic or that we need to throw out all these techniques, but with any technique in archaeology, be it a dating technique or an interpretive technique, we have to be critical, right? We have to think about what the strengths and the limitations of these methods are. Okay, we're going to talk about this in class on Thursday, but I just wanted to present to you one example of, again, the intersection of all these issues and limitations of these approaches, how they then intersect with our bias and basically that knowledge that we bring and expectations and assumptions that we bring as archaeologists to interpreting these materials, right? So again, we have to think about what evidence is and what facts are in archaeology, and then we have to think about how our interpretation of, again, evidence and facts is shaped by who we are as archaeologists, by the culture in which we're produced, the training we receive, etc., etc., etc. And Warrior Grave BJ 581 from the Birka site in Sweden is an excellent example of this, right? That initial arguments were based that this individual was male on the basis of material culture, but then subsequent analyses, including looking at skeletal traits, at genetic analyses, but also isotopic analysis, have demonstrated that this individual was a biological female. But then we have to think about the complication that, biological sex does not always equate with gender. We have to think about how these ideas change over time. And so we'll talk a little bit more about some of the issues with this interpretation in our discussion this week. And I'm sure a lot of you will have insights into this. Of course, the whole Viking culture thing is a huge thing in popular culture right now. It's very interesting and engaging. There's a lot of information out there about it, but there's still a lot of debate as well. So we'll talk about that as well. So the next thing I wanted to prompt you for in preparation for class this week is this question. So what does a feminist bioarchaeology look like then, right? Because remember that feminism and intersectional feminism is one of the guiding theoretical frameworks for this entire course. So I want you to think about that then, right? So how can we apply intersectionality to the analysis of human skeletal remains and their associated grave goods? Well, a lot of your answers are probably going to come from this week's reading, or one of the readings for this topic, which is Geller's 2008 article, Fomenting a Feminist Bioarchaeology. And again, a lot of the arguments that Geller makes, I want to talk about in class so we can examine them. We can look at, she provides, or they, I should say, provides, I don't know the gender of our author here, but they provide some very well-supported, compelling arguments about how these points, right? How culture creeps into our understanding of sex, how biomedicine has shaped our understanding of biological sex, how we have a problem in the past in terms of how the terminology of sex and gender, and even to the present day, this day, are used interchangeably, and therefore this impacts our interpretations and our understanding of interpretations and our ability to critique them. And then talks about as well some of the methods as well in terms of how bioarchaeology is conducted. And so goes into some of the points that I've alluded to or mentioned here, but does it in a bit more comprehensive way. So these are discussion questions we'll be talking about. So some of the main points of her argument, again, some of the historical points, not just bioarchaeology, but also how early feminist, what she calls, or they call, sorry, inspired, feminist-inspired bioarchaeological works, how they both succeeded and failed. And also this question of, well, should we really care, or is it important that we challenge this heteronormative binary of male and female in bioarchaeology? Like maybe, again, how much of our contemporary intersectional feminism is actually, quote unquote, causing the problem, right? Unquote, end quote, in terms of how we do bioarchaeology, because the reality is we do have biological males and we do have biological females. And again, people in the past may not have been aware of things like intersex variation. It may not have been as critical or as important, but still we need to talk about these things. And so that's what I'm hoping our discussion this week will really get into. So we can also think about just the practice of doing bioarchaeology and doing sex estimation and then making interpretations about the sex and gender of an individual. We also have to think about the theoretical framework as well. And again, so like I said, in this course, we're using this guiding, broader, external to anthropology, but part of anthropology, intersectional feminist framework, but also thinking about how we need to change bioarchaeology potentially as a discipline, right? And so I didn't assign this article or this reading, but I thought it would be interesting to pull in a couple of points from a 2002 textbook chapter by Arnold, who, as I state here, provides a really compelling framework for teasing out sex and gender from burials, right? But what's key about this gets to one of the points I mentioned about some of the problems or limitations we have with sex estimation of human skeletal remains, is that a lot of the methods we develop work really effectively when we're dealing with populations and individuals in known populations, not individual burials, right? So when we're dealing with cemeteries, now we can start to look at broader patterns, and we can start to understand how that society constructed sex and gender, right? And how this construction is represented and captured in mortuary practices, right? And so what Arnold has established is some criteria then for cemetery analysis, and you'll notice that it is intersectional, even though I don't think Arnold ever explicitly uses that term. But just says that first we have to start about thinking about how many different categories of grave good assemblages or burial treatments are identifiable. And so we can think about this in terms of, are they single burials or multiple burials? Are they individuals who are buried in extended positions on their back, or do we have cremains? So individuals who have been cremated. If they're cremated, where are they placed? Do we have ossuary houses? So thinking about all the different kinds of burial types or grave good assemblages that are also found within a cemetery is the first step. And then the next thing we can look for is age specific. And this is because when it comes to age, there's a lot less cultural bias in terms of how we recognize cultural categories, right? So we do have these biological markers for aging that we can look at and document, right? So then we can look at age specific, right? So we can identify those individuals who are infants or even fetal to children to adults, right? So we can even have some broad age categories. And we can look and see that if there's any connection between ages of individuals and the burial treatments they receive. So for example, in some parts of the world, infants, for example, are cremated, whereas adults receive full burials because it's related to rites of passage and your status within a society, right? In other cultures, there aren't age-specific variations, so just teasing out these kind of patterns are critical. Then the next thing we can start to look at is how these patterns then, so right, we're building in this intersectional approach, going from assemblages and treatments to age to biological sex, right? We're looking at how they overlap. We're looking at individuals who have what is called disjunction, and I'll show how Arnold defines disjunction on the next slide, but also individuals who stand out, who are unique, who don't follow any of the patterns, and trying to figure out what the explanation for that is. Again, is it age or sex related, or is there another potential explanation, right? So think about, again, we'll remember we talked about that wheel of all the different aspects of our identity and how they relate to oppression, stuff like that, right? We can think about how ethnicity and religion and education and nationality and ability or disability and all of these things could impact one individual's burial within these broader patterns, right? And sometimes we don't know how much variation a particular individual has been exposed to or treated to, or how it reflects their individual identity versus group identity until we look at a group. So this is, again, one of the strengths of the cemetery level analyses. And then the other thing we want to look at are disjunctions that are found with males, females, and possible intersex individuals. And again, are they restricted to a single sex? Sorry, there's a typo in there as well. Okay. So this is where Arnold introduces these concepts of conjunction and disjunction, and it's basically what I like about this is not necessarily the terminology of conjunction or alignment or matching versus disjunction, or where things don't kind of match up or they're not all the same or there's something that seems out of whack, is just recognizing that there's a whole bunch of ways in which we can have disjunctions, right? Or explain disjunctions, right? So conjunctions, of course, would occur is that when we can identify the biological sex in a consistent way that assigns an individual to male or to female, and then their archaeological correlates are the same, basically, of a gender, right? So a biological male is buried with goods that are associated and interpreted with males, right? Or all the males within the cemetery have the same goods associated with them, right? And then the same thing would happen with the females. Disjunction can then occur when, for example, when the archaeological correlate is different, right? That we have an individual who, based on, again, the analysis of the entire cemetery, has been assigned or estimated to have the sex of male, but then there's a difference in terms of the material goods that are found, right? So that the material goods or the grave goods that are found with them, or the way that they were buried, is more consistent with females, biological females within the cemetery. And of course, the opposite can occur where we have a biological female individual with a male gender. But then we can have these other categories, and I recognize here that some of the terminology Arnold's using here, pseudo-hermaphrodite and hermaphrodite, are not I don't want to say politically correct, but they're not necessarily the kind of terminology that's used as widely. Again, just the term intersex or intersex variation is used more widely. But again, we can think about how we might genetically be able to identify various intersex variations, and then how then this might present itself in terms of gender. And what is noted here as well is that intersex variation, again, is currently is not something we attempt to capture from just skeletal analyses, right? If an individual has a mix of male and female traits, then we tend to assign that individual as a probable male or female, or as an ambiguous individual, right? So, but it's really genetically is when we're talking about intersex variation. So these are all the sources of conjunction or disjunction that may occur, right? So clearly there's a lot more than just simply assuming, oh, this was an individual who was male and presenting as female. There's how we then explain that disjunction is where that next level of interpretation comes into play. So that's why then I wanted to talk about Tomb 7. And I love these two articles, not because everything about them is perfect, but I think they're interesting. You'll notice that in the readings, when we get into archaeological examples, I've tried to go and get articles from around the world. So we get different perspectives and we can look at different cultures, right? So we had a slide about a potential Viking burial at Birka in Sweden, and now we have Tomb 7 at Monte Alban, right? So in Mesoamerica. So the other reason why I chose these two articles is that I wanted to show you also how debate and discourse occurs in archaeology, right? That there was the original article by McCafferty et al., which was then responded to and critiqued by Flannery et al., that this is a valid and accepted format of basically not just peer review, but of critique and discourse and discussion in archaeology. So what we're going to talk about in class is this week in our discussion is the central arguments of each paper, the evidence that they use to support their arguments, and then I'd like to get a feel for what arguments you agree with and why, because what you'll see, spoiler alert or not if you've already read the articles, is that McCafferty and Flannery interpret Tomb 7 differently because of the theoretical approaches that they're taking. Okay. And then just for fun, I included a couple of examples. I love these examples. And this is kind of my response to why we need to be critical of heteronormativity in our interpretations, is that the reality is that we're not the only ones engaging in discussion about archaeology, that archaeology is very fascinating to members of the general public. It's probably why many of you took a course, because you hear about archaeological sites or archaeological evidence and interpretations and exciting new finds that change everything we know about history. Well, not really. But I love this awesome cartoon by Chris Halbeck, right? So in the upper left-hand corner, Doom lovers discovered an archaeological dig of town discovered by volcano, and the person reading this article is like, or not the person reading the article. So now presumably we cut away from the media representation to a lab, and here's the scientists, and the one's like, hey, Kevin, here's those lab results you asked for. They both are female. And now the media is re-reporting saying two friends are amongst many discoveries in archaeological dig of Doom Town. And then I included not just this comic, but also then the comments I love, including his title for this, which is Erased, talking about, again, this idea of how we erase then not just sexes, or make invisible particular sexes or genders, but we erase sexuality often in our interpretations as well, right? That all of a sudden, instead of these two individuals being lovers because they're found to be the same biological sex, now they're just a couple of gals being pals, right? Here's another example of this. Again, another illustrator that I follow on Instagram posted this, and I love this. So this is an image, as it states here, that's used in some 17th century ballads. And then the description, and this is the description that accompanies this image, states, there is no clue as to what these two women in bed together are doing. The image might represent a mistress and servant, or two friends sharing a bed, as many did away from home, but they are apparently bracing. I'll just note as well that both of the individuals are not wearing clothing in their embracing in a bedroom. So, but we have no clue what these two women in bed are doing, right? So again, this is the other thing we have to be cautious of, is that when we're looking at analyses, particularly of individuals who have been found in association or found in cemeteries, about how our own biases our own cultures, our own understanding of gender and sexuality shape our interpretations and also that of the public as well. So I'm looking forward to discussion this week. I hope I've provided sufficient background here. I also am looking forward to your feedback on these videos. So take care, and I'll see you then.